The moment his consciousness fully settled into reality, it was as if the entire galaxy blinked at the same time and forgot how to pretend it was stable. And I, still screaming silently inside my own mind, felt the Emperor's attention move, not like a gaze, but like a judgment forming across infinite space, and every psycho within reach of the Astronomican collapsed in unison, as though a single invisible hand had pressed them down into the concept of submission itself. And the golden throne, that ancient machine of suffering and divinity, responded with a sound no machine should ever make, a low breaking resonance like metal remembering it was once flesh. In the halls of terror, beneath the impossible weight of 10,000 years of accumulated prayer and decay, the custodians stood frozen for the first time in recorded history, not because they were afraid of death, but because something worse had entered the room, and certainty. The Emperor's presence did not feel like salvation. It felt like remembering a truth that had been deliberately buried under centuries of worship, and that truth began to leak into the minds of those closest to him like poison turning into revelation. I saw fragments of his thoughts, not complete, never complete, but enough to ruin faith. Worlds burning not by chaos alone, but by imperial hands. Endless crusades that forgot their purpose. Trillions sacrificed not for victory but for maintenance of a collapsing idea called humanity. And in that moment I understood the Emperor had not awakened into hope, he had awakened into accounting. The Astronomican flared brighter, violently so, as if trying to drown out what he was seeing, but it only made things worse. Across segmentum fleets, navigators began to weep blood as the guiding light shifted its tone, becoming less a beacon and more a warning, like a god changing his mind mid-prayer on Terra itself. The High Lords of Terra convened in panic disguised as protocol, their voices trembling behind layers of ritual certainty, but every decree they issued was answered by silence from the throne, a silence that felt heavier than any command, as if the Emperor was listening without approving of the concept of response. I was not supposed to be here, I was never meant to perceive any of this, but the psychic rupture had pulled me deeper into the imperial web than any mortal should survive, and I saw him again more clearly this time, not a corpse, not a statue, but something partially assembled from willpower and agony. Eyes open now, but not focused on the present. Instead, moving through time itself like a man walking through ruins he had built and no longer recognized. Then came the first act of communication. It was not speech, it was correction. Every mind tethered to the throne received a single pulse of meaning that shattered language before it could form, and what remained translated imperfectly into thought. This is not what I intended. The phrase spread through the psychic network like a disease that cured nothing but certainty, and across the Imperium, entire systems lost cohesion as commanders hesitated for the first time in their lives, unsure whether obedience still equaled survival. Somewhere deep within the Imperial Palace, the machinery of the Golden Throne began to fail in ways that were not mechanical but philosophical, as if the Emperor's awareness was no longer compatible with the system built to sustain him unconscious, and the Adeptus Mechanicus began chanting faster, louder, more desperate, as though faith could substitute for understanding when reality began to break its own laws. I felt my body dissolving at the edges of perception, but I could not look away, because something in his presence demanded witness, not devotion. And then he looked outward, not at Terra, not at humanity, but at the entire Imperium as a single structure, and I understood that he was not searching for enemies anymore. He was searching for what remained of his original idea. In that gaze, whole sectors of space flickered as if reality itself was being audited, and I saw fleets vanish, not destroyed, but erased from narrative relevance, as though they had been deemed mistakes too small to justify existing in a corrected universe. The warp screamed in response, not in anger but in fear, and for the first time since the Horus heresy, the Chaos Gods did not act, they watched. In the brief stillness between galactic heartbeats, I realized the Emperor was no longer merely awakening. He was deciding whether humanity deserved continuity, somewhere far below, on the lowest levels of Terra, where sunlight is a myth and hope is a currency no one can afford. Ordinary humans began to feel it too, a pressure in their dreams, a sense that something absolute had returned and was measuring them without mercy. I tried to pray, but I did not know to whom anymore, because even faith felt outdated in the presence of something so final. The Emperor's mind continued to expand through reality like ink in water, rewriting perception itself, and I understood the terrifying possibility forming in the silence. Salvation had always been assumed to be the end of suffering, but what if salvation was simply the end of tolerance? And in that thought, I felt him consider us, again, not as children, not as soldiers, but as an unfinished equation that had run too long without correction. Then everything went white inside my mind. and I heard the final fragment before my consciousness fractured further. Not anger, not love, but judgment, suspended mid-air. The second pulse of awareness did not feel like time passing, it felt like time being examined, pinched between unseen fingers, and judged for its imperfections. And I realized then that what I had mistaken for silence after his awakening was only the moment reality takes before it realizes it is no longer in control, because the Emperor of Mankind had begun to move his attention outward through the rotting spine of the Imperium, and every layer of existence he touched responded like a wound being reopened. I could feel it through the fractured psychic lattice of terror, through the screaming remnants of what once was communication between astropaths, through the trembling minds of millions who suddenly dreamed the same impossible dream. A throne room, stretching beyond geometry, a dying god bound in gold and iron, and a pair of eyes finally seeing everything he had built. There was no mercy in that sight, not yet anger either, only a terrifying clarity that stripped meaning from everything it touched. And I found myself remembering things I had never personally lived: old wars, ancient oaths, forgotten promises made during the Great Crusade when humanity still believed expansion was the same as salvation. The Emperor's consciousness pressed deeper into the Astronomican, and the beacon that once guided ships through the hell of the warp began to stutter like a dying heartbeat. Because it was no longer simply a light, it was being interpreted by its creator again. Across the void, Imperial fleets reported phenomena they could not name, stars shifting position by fractions of impossible angles, warp routes collapsing into non-existence, entire battle groups emerging from translation only to find themselves orbiting sisters that no longer existed in any record. And through it all, the Emperor's presence expanded like a slow, inevitable tide, not rushing, not chaotic, but deliberate, as though he was reading his own empire sentence by sentence. Somewhere deep within the Imperial Palace, the Adeptus Mechanicus began to chant louder, their binary prayers escalating into something almost panicked, because even their sacred machine spirits were no longer responding with certainty. Instead, they hesitated, as if waiting for permission to continue functioning. The Golden Throne itself, the ancient, unbearable construct known across the Imperium as the life-supporting prison of the Emperor, groaned under a new kind of pressure, not physical, not electrical, but conceptual, as though it had been designed for a consciousness that had been asleep and was now waking up inside it. I saw flashes through his perception again, sharper this time, less fragmented, endless rows of Imperial worlds burning under administrative neglect, planets sacrificed not to chaos but to bureaucracy, and above it all the rigid structure of belief that had replaced in the name of stability, and above it all but at all the of it all but of all of above it all, above of up without of it all play of a plea and a play and play and burn play to pull with plan and up play with up out will up and I go and for the first time, I felt something change in him, not emotion as humans understand it, but recalibration. The Emperor was adjusting to what humanity had become without him. Then came the second communication, and it was not a thought this time, but a rupture in meaning so absolute it nearly erased language from existence. Every psyker across the segmentum solar convulsed as the message passed through them, and what remained in their shattered minds was only a single concept rendered in infinite variation. Deviation exceeds acceptable bounds. The phrase echoed through the Imperial web like a verdict being stamped onto reality itself. And in that moment entire command structures began to collapse, not because they were destroyed, but because they were suddenly unsure whether they had ever been correct. On Terra, the High Lords attempted to respond through ritualized protocol, issuing decrees meant to stabilize faith and authority, but each proclamation seemed to dissolve before reaching the throne's deeper awareness. Like ink dropped into a burning sun, the Emperor was no longer merely observing the Imperium of man. He was comparing it to the blueprint that still existed somewhere inside him, and I realized with growing horror that the Imperium as it stood might not survive comparison. The warp reacted violently to this realization, not with aggression, but with something closer to panic, as if the chaos gods themselves had noticed a fundamental change in the rules of their hunting ground. I saw shapes forming at the edge of perception, vast, impossible intelligences pressing closer, not daring to interfere but unable to look away. And still the Emperor continued to awaken further. The sense of him inside the golden throne shifted, and for a brief moment I felt something like Mobentan attempt to rise, or at least to test the boundaries of his confinement. The throne screamed in response, ancient systems overloading, psychic conduits flaring white-hot, and for the first time in 10,000 years, alarms that no living human had ever heard began to echo through the Imperial Palace. Custodians moved then, not in battle formation, but in uncertainty, their perfect discipline strained by the realization that the thing they had sworn to protect might no longer be a thing that required protection. And deeper still, beneath all of it, I felt the Emperor's attention pause on humanity itself, not on its fleets, not on its worlds, but on its shape, its structure, its failure to resemble what he once intended. That pause was worse than judgment, because judgment implies emotion, and what I felt then was analysis. Somewhere far beyond Terra, in the cold darkness between stars, Imperial citizens began to report miracles and nightmares blending together. Saints crying tears of blood that formed symbols no one recognized, machines refusing to obey commands that contradicted unseen logic, entire hive cities falling silent as if listening to something far away. And I, still bound within the collapsing psychic relay, understood that the Emperor's awakening was not an event happening in one place, it was a correction propagating through existence itself. The final thing I witnessed in that cycle was his perception narrowing slightly, focusing not on the past, not on the Imperium as a whole, but on the concept of leadership, of governance, of what humanity had chosen to become in his absence. And within that narrowing focus, I felt the faintest trace of something almost unbearable for me, not anger, not forgiveness, but decision. Then the connection fractured again, and I was left hanging in the aftermath like a broken signal drifting through an uncaring void, knowing only this: the Emperor was no longer asleep, and what he was becoming would not recognize anything that had survived in his absence. The third descent into his awareness did not begin with sound or vision, but with structure like reality itself being reorganized into a language that no living mind was meant to understand. And I felt myself slipping deeper into that structure, as if I were no longer an observer but a notation inside a sentence written by something infinitely older than comprehension. The Emperor's consciousness was no longer spreading randomly through the Astronomican, it was stabilizing, forming boundaries, establishing internal logic, and in doing so, it was beginning to define what the Imperium actually was, in the present tense, not the myth, not the sermons, but the raw accumulated truth of 10,000 years without him. And that truth, I realized with growing dread, was not merely decay, it was mutation. The Emperor saw every layer at once. The noble lies spoken by priests to keep hope alive, the administrative wars committed up spolians, comministrative or spolians apolians. It is a minister of wars, scornelis of enlians, it's a lenus of elenanes of inledians, so seminis of it alls, and beninis it to anisid is it on to me is a kinded bimplus and in bukun and to and bon and berg to pubamapa pimple pop plupon and prin will win purple pop go with up pomon with up will a wala people up without life for work go above work do a man for the simple smell to a banana of our little Cebu and Popwell and homeless some more seven some on listen never cannot obedience so absolute it had replaced thought. I felt his attention pause on this, not in confusion, but in something colder, evaluation of efficiency versus intent. Across Terra, the Golden Throne's mechanisms continued to fail in cascading cycles, but now the failures were synchronized, as though the machine was being overwritten in real time by its original architect. The Adeptus Mechanicus did not understand what was happening, and for the first time in their ancient doctrines, their chants contained hesitation rather than certainty, because even their machine spirits seemed to be listening to something higher than their code. I saw the Emperor's perception extend further outward, beyond Terra, beyond the segmentum solar, touching worlds that had long since become unrecognizable reflections of his original design. On hive worlds where billions lived, stacked upon billions, he observed systems of survival built entirely on suffering. On fortress worlds, he saw eternal war turned into identity. On shrine worlds, he saw belief crystallized into infrastructure so dense it had replaced reality itself. And through all of it, there was one consistent pattern: humanity had learned to endure everything except change. Then the Emperor did something that no one anticipated, not even those fragments of him that still lingered in myth and faith. He began to compare, not emotionally, but structurally. Each world, each system, each doctrine was measured against a silent template buried deep within his resurrected awareness, and the result of that comparison spread through the psychic lattice like frost forming on glass. I felt millions of psychers suddenly understand, without being told, that they were being evaluated, and that realization alone caused thousands to break. Somewhere in the outer fleets, entire command structures froze mid-order as officers felt an inexplicable sense of being observed by something that did not approve of improvisation. The warp reacted again, but differently this time, not in chaos, not in fury, but in tension, like predators sensing a shift in hierarchy. I saw the entities that dwell beyond reality retreat slightly from certain regions of the Imperium, as if unwilling to be present for what came next. And then came the third communication. It did not spread like thought or language, it imposed itself like geometry. Every mind connected to the Astronomican experienced it simultaneously, and what they received was not a message, but a verdict structure, a layered concept that collapsed into words only after the human mind had already been reshaped to receive it. System integrity compromised. Continuity model deviates from original parameters. The meaning behind it was worse than any command or condemnation, because it implied that everything humanity had built since his incapacitation was being interpreted as an error condition. On Terra, the High Lords attempted to assert authority through ritualized hierarchy, but their power no longer felt like power. It felt like outdated syntax being executed in the presence of a newer system. The Golden Throne responded to the Emperor's internal recalibration with violent feedback loops, and entire sections of the Imperial Palace began to suffer localized reality, distortion corridors stretching too long, statues weeping oil that turned into symbols mid-fall, air thickening with psychic pressure that made breathing feel like trespass. I felt myself being pulled closer again, deeper into his perception, and what I saw there shattered something fundamental in me. He was no longer simply remembering what humanity was supposed to be. He was actively reconstructing the decision tree that led to what it became. And every branch of that reconstruction ended in failure. Then I saw something else, a hesitation, not weakness, but interruption. Somewhere within the vast, collapsing architecture of his consciousness, there was resistance not from an external enemy, but from within his own accumulated will, as if 10,000 years of enforced stasis had not only preserved him, but layered him with contradictions he now had to resolve before he could proceed. The Emperor paused on humanity itself again, and this time the pause carried weight. I felt him consider not just what humanity had become, but what it would require to be corrected, and in that consideration, I understood the most terrifying possibility yet. Correction might not preserve the current form. Across the galaxy, saints fell silent mid-prayer, psychers screamed without sound, and machines across the Mechanicus network halted as if awaiting a command that had not yet been formulated. The warp itself grew still in localized pockets, like a storm pausing to listen. And then, deeper than all of it, I felt the Emperor begin to make a distinction that would decide everything that followed, the difference between what was worth preserving and what was merely inherited. That distinction was not spoken, it was calculated, and once calculated, it could not be unthought. The connection fractured again, leaving me drifting in the psychic residue of a decision still forming, knowing only that the Emperor was no longer reacting to humanity. He was redesigning the meaning of humanity itself. The fourth surge of his awareness did not feel like expansion anymore, it felt like arrival, as though something that had been traveling through the wrong version of reality had finally stepped into alignment with itself, and in that alignment I understood that the Emperor was no longer merely perceiving the Imperium, he was inhabiting it in reverse, pulling its totality into his mind so completely that distance itself began to lose meaning, and I, still trapped within the shattered psychic relay, became less an observer and more a fragment drifting inside a thought too large to finish. The Astronomican, once a beacon of guidance for the void, was now something else entirely, a living memory being reinterpreted by its originator, and every ship, every fleet, every lost traveler between. The stars felt it as a subtle but absolute shift in orientation, like a compass suddenly remembering that north was only ever a suggestion. Across the Imperium, psychers stopped screaming because screaming implies continuity of self, and many simply ceased to maintain coherent identity for moments at a time as his attention brushed across them, not with violence, but with the unbearable intimacy of being understood without consent. I saw him now not as a figure upon a throne, but as a presence layered across reality itself, still bound physically to the Golden Throne, yet no longer contained by it, like a mind learning that its prison was never physical but procedural, constructed from necessity, ritual, and the accumulated fear of collapse. The Golden Throne groaned beneath him in ways no Mechanicus scripture had prepared for, because its ancient systems were not designed to withstand consciousness that was awake and aware of its own architecture. They were designed to sustain a myth, and myths do not resist inspection. Somewhere deep within Terra's impossible structure, entire levels of the Imperial Palace began to lose definition, as if their purpose had been questioned so thoroughly that even stone forgot why it was stone. The Emperor's awareness moved outward again, and this time it did not scan or observe, it categorized. Worlds were no longer seen as places, but as functions. Hive worlds became calculations of endurance versus entropy. Forge worlds became equations of production versus dependency. Shrine worlds became feedback loops of belief reinforcing control. And in that categorization, I felt something terrifying emerge. Efficiency as morality. Not cruelty, not mercy, but pure structural necessity overriding historical sentiment. The warp responded instantly, not in chaos, but in agitation, because the idea of something so absolute entering judgment of material reality disrupted even the oldest predators of the Imperium. I saw entities recoiling behind veils of unreality, not fleeing fear of destruction, but fear of definition. And then the Emperor did something that changed everything. Again he began to remember forward, not backward into history, but forward into consequence. Every possible outcome of the Imperium's continued existence unfolded within his awareness like branching collapse scenarios, and each one ended not in victory or defeat, but in repetition of the same systemic decay. I felt him reach a conclusion not yet spoken into reality, and that conclusion rippled through the Astronomican as a pressure wave of silent understanding. Continuity without correction equals recursion. On Terra, the High Lords felt this without receiving words, and for the first time in 10,000 years, their authority did not feel questioned by rebellion or heresy, but by relevance itself. Even the custodians, perfect as they were, experienced a moment of internal fracture, not doubt in loyalty, but doubt in definition. What do you protect when the object of protection begins to redefine itself? The Emperor's presence intensified again, and I was pulled deeper, closer, until I was no longer inside a relay, but inside the shadow of his attention itself. I saw fragments of his perception overlapping, the birth of imperial dogma turning into rigid doctrine, the rise of faith replacing understanding, the endless machinery of bureaucracy growing around him like coral around a sunken relic, and beneath it all, a single constant: humanity had survived him, but not his intention. Then came the fourth communication, and it was not a statement or a command, but a restructuring of language itself. Meaning arrived first, raw and unfiltered, before collapsing into words the human mind could survive. Preservation of current trajectory is statistically incompatible with intended outcome. The Imperium did not hear this as language, it felt it as existential instability. Across thousands of worlds, governors paused mid-decree, priests forgot sermons mid-recitation, and soldiers felt a sudden, inexplicable sense that their victories had been measured and found irrelevant. The warp grew still again, but this time the stillness felt anticipatory, like something vast holding its breath. I saw the Emperor's attention narrow once more, not in limitation, but in focus, and that focus was directed not at systems or fleets or institutions, but at humanity itself as a species variable. Every human life across the galaxy, billions upon billions of concurrent existences, was held within that focus as a single dataset, and I understood, with a clarity that nearly broke what remained of my mind, that he was not deciding what humanity had done, he was deciding what humanity was. In that moment, the distinction between worship and survival collapsed entirely. The Emperors were pressed deeper into the Golden Throne, and the machine responded with agony translated into light, flaring across Terra's highest spires like a second sun trying to be born inside a cathedral. Entire segments of the Imperial Palace began to desynchronize from physical law, existing for seconds outside causality before snapping back into place. The custodians moved closer, not to defend him, but to witness him, because even they could no longer be certain what their purpose meant in the presence of a consciousness rewriting its own boundaries. And then, within the deepest part of his awareness, I could perceive, something shifted again, not decision, not action, but recognition. The Emperor had begun to understand the full scale of what 10,000 years of absence had done, not just to humanity, but to the idea of humanity itself. And in that recognition, I felt the first true silence that was not absence, but preparation. Then the connection collapsed, and I was left adrift in a galaxy that suddenly felt like it was waiting to be edited. The fifth awakening felt like a quiet catastrophe, not an explosion but a rewriting of everything that wants to find the difference between inside and outside, because at this stage the Emperor was no longer simply perceiving reality, he was folding it into himself, and I understood that what I had thought was his consciousness expanding was actually the collapse of separation between observer and observed, until there was nothing left but a single mind holding the entire Imperium, like a thought it had just remembered too clearly. I had so memted to live, to clish it have so lie, to click I had to bend, a purple color play a bump, and to mill and for it, in whip up, whip, whip up, to pull up, purple up, whip up, what up, The Astronomican, once a guiding star for desperate fleets in the void, had become something far more intimate and far more terrifying, a diagnostic reflection of its own origin, and every ship that relied upon it now traveled not through space, but through the Emperor's attention, as though the galaxy itself had been reduced to pathways inside a living mind. Across Terra, the Golden Throne no longer sounded like a machine under strain. It sounded like a system being understood too deeply, and understanding, in this context, was indistinguishable from dismantling. I felt him move through the Imperium's structure again, but this time there was no hesitation, no comparison, no moral weighting, only inevitability as he traced every institution, every doctrine, every war, every sacrifice, not as history, but as ongoing function, and the function was failing. That realization spread through him like a stillness so absolute it made prayer feel like noise. The warp reacted in a way I had never felt before, not fear, not rage, but a kind of withdrawal, as though even the Imperium itself was stepping back from the edge of a conclusion it did not want to witness fully formed. I saw the Chaos Gods, not directly, but as absences in pressure, vast intelligences ceasing to press forward, suddenly attentive in a way that suggested calculation rather than hunger. The Emperor's awareness continued to refine itself, stripping away redundancy from perception, until entire sectors of the Imperium ceased to exist as independent concepts within his mind, and instead became subsystems of a single decaying organism. And in that framing, humanity was no longer a species or a civilization. It was a maintenance problem that had been left running unattended for too long. I felt the moment this thought stabilized, because reality itself reacted, not with change, but with recognition, as though existence had been waiting for this classification to be finalized before responding. On Terra, the High Lords experienced something like collective vertigo, not from physical movement, but from the sudden loss of conceptual authority. Their decrees no longer felt like commands shaping reality, but like echoes inside a system that had begun routing decision-making elsewhere. Even the custodians, bound by perfection and loyalty beyond doubt, stood in a strange stillness that was not confusion, but recalibration, because they could no longer determine whether they were guardians of the Emperor or artifacts of his previous state. I was pulled deeper still, until I felt myself no longer existing as an individual consciousness, but as a point of sensitivity inside his perception, and through that point I saw the Imperium as he now saw it, not a realm of countless stars, but a single vast structure of suffering held together by belief in continuity. Then came the fifth communication, and it arrived without transition, as if thought itself had been compressed into a singularity and released directly into Hev. Current system architecture diverges beyond acceptable variance thresholds. The phrase did not carry emotion extraterrest. The phrase did insisted because it may seduce the frost. This carries the phrase because diverse it because it cause it per and it cause but precur command put it and poke procur perm the per my propen pla and luck with prominent up prelet with up implied a standard still existing somewhere above everything humanity had become. Across thousands of worlds, Imperial leaders felt an unspoken terror rise not from external threat, but from audit. The warp itself shuddered again, and this time I saw something I never thought possible. Regions of the Imperium falling temporarily silent, as though even chaos required a moment to reconsider its position. The Emperor's attention narrowed further, focusing now on what lay beneath all structures: humanity's base state, stripped of doctrine, stripped of faith, stripped of empire, and what he found there was not purity, not corruption, but variability, infinite deviation, infinite inconsistency, infinite survival strategies accumulated over 10,000 years of absence. I felt him process this not as judgment, but as input. And then, for the first time since his awakening, there was a shift that was not analytical, it was directional, not toward destruction, not toward preservation, toward resolution. The Golden Throne responded violently, as if it understood that something within its function was being redefined at the most fundamental level. Entire psychic conduits flared and collapsed simultaneously, producing waves of light that washed through Terra's highest spires like silent storms. I saw the Imperial Palace not as architecture anymore, but as a boundary conditions, something designed to contain a state of being that was no longer valid. The custodians moved closer still, but their movements now carried a different weight, not defense, not duty, but witness to transformation that could not be stopped by intention. And within the deepest layer of his awareness I could reach, I felt him approach something like conclusion, though it was not yet shaped into form. Humanity, as it existed, was no longer being evaluated for worth or failure, it was being evaluated for compatibility with continuation, and in that evaluation, everything paused, not stopped, paused, as though the entire galaxy had been placed between two thoughts. Then the connection fractured once more, but this time it did not feel like loss, it felt like anticipation becoming conscious of itself. The sixth and final awakening did not feel like arrival anymore, it felt like completion, as though something that had been assembling itself across 10,000 years of silence had finally reached the moment, where all remaining contradictions were forced to resolve into a single unavoidable shape. And the first, no longer certain whether I still possessed a self or was merely a residual echo inside his perception, understood that the Emperor was no longer inside the Golden Throne. The Golden Throne was inside him. Reality did not break when this realization formed. It simply stopped pretending that it had ever been separate from him in the first place. The Astronomican, once a beacon, once a guide, once a symbol of desperate hope in the void, had become an organ of attention, and every ship across the Imperium now traveled not by navigation but by being remembered in the correct direction. And I truly saw it for the first time without fragmentation, that the Emperor of mankind was no longer awakening in stages. He was consolidating. Every previous surge of awareness had been an integration of scattered cognition, but now there were no fragments left to unify. Only totality remained. Across Terra, the Imperial Palace no longer felt like a fortress or throne world, but like a structure undergoing conceptual inspection, every layer of its existence exposed to a gaze that did not require movement to traverse distance. The custodians stood in absolute stillness, not because they were ordered to, not because they were uncertain, but because something within their genetic purpose had reached its final boundary condition. There was no protocol for witnessing the end of interpretation itself. The Golden Throne screamed out in sound, but in structural refusal, as if a machine built to preserve stasis had discovered it was being used to maintain a mind that no longer required stasis at all. And then the Emperor looked outward one final time, not across Terra, not across the segmentum, across the entirety of the Imperium as a single, unified object of thought. In that gaze, I felt every contradiction humanity had ever produced collapse into visibility. Faith built on ignorance, order built on contradiction, survival built on suffering so normalized it had become culture. And yet, beneath all of it, something else persisted in endurance that had outlasted logic itself. Humanity had not merely survived 10,000 years without him, it had evolved into something that could survive even the consequences of his return. That realization introduced a pause deeper than any silence before it. Not hesitation, not doubt, calibration. I felt him measure not what humanity had become, but what would remain if everything incompatible with intention was removed. And in that measurement, I saw futures fracture into branching possibilities so vast they ceased to be visions and became statistical atmospheres, entire galaxies, reorganizing around different outcomes of a single decision not yet finalized. The warp reacted violently again, but this time it was different from fear or withdrawal, it was attention. Even the Chaos Gods, those ancient parasites of emotion and contradiction, were no longer interfering. They were watching because something had entered the immaterium that did not generate emotion for them to consume, it generated structure. And structure, to beings born of instability, was more threatening than annihilation. I felt the Emperor's consciousness press deeper into humanity itself, not as individuals, not as populations, but as an underlying pattern of behavior repeated across millennia. Obedience, adaptation, suffering, resilience, repetition. and within that pattern, he found what he had not been able to see before the adaptation had itself become intelligence. Humanity had learned how to persist even in contradiction to its own design. The Golden Throne responded again, weaker now, not resisting so much as acknowledging that its original purpose had been surpassed. Entire sections of Terra's psychic infrastructure ceased functioning, not through destruction, but through obsolescence. I felt myself being pulled closer to the center of his awareness than ever before, until even the concept of being pulled became unnecessary to describe proximity. And then the final communication arrived. It did not fracture minds. It did not impose meaning. It simply existed, and existence alone forced comprehension. Final evaluation complete. Across the Imperium, every psyker, every navigator, every soul touched by the Astronomican experienced that moment as if time itself had inhaled. There was no declaration of judgment, no proclamation of salvation or extinction, only recognition. And within that recognition, I felt something unprecedented. The Emperor did not reject humanity. He did not accept it either, he understood it. And understanding, in his state, was the most absolute force that had ever existed. I saw him rise not physically, not in the way mortals define motion, but as a restructuring of presence within reality itself, as though the concept of enthroned could no longer contain what he had become. The Golden Throne did not shatter, it did not fail. It simply stopped being the thing that defined him. Tara itself trembled as the psychic pressure that had held it in stasis for 10,000 years redistributed across the galaxy like the first breath of a new system replacing an old one. The warp went still in a way that felt unnatural even to itself, as though something within it had been rewritten at its source. And I, the last fragment still conscious within the relay, understood with absolute clarity that what came next was no longer the return of a god, or the awakening of an emperor, or the continuation of an empire. It was the beginning of revision, and revision does not ask for permission from what it replaces. The final thing I saw before the connection collapsed entirely was his attention turning away from judgment itself, not because judgment was complete, but because it was no longer sufficient as a framework for what remained. And in that shift, I understood the last truth I would ever be allowed to comprehend. Humanity was not being saved, nor condemned, nor destroyed. It was being rewritten into something that could survive being seen clearly. Then even that thought dissolved, and the galaxy continued no longer unaware of him, but no longer separate from him either.